I moved into the Whispering Pines subdivision in October of 2018. The name itself was a joke, considering there wasn't a single pine tree within a 10-mile radius of the place. It was one of those massive, overly ambitious housing developments out in the flat sprawl of northern Texas, about 40 minutes outside of Dallas. The original plan called for over 300 homes, a community pool, a clubhouse, the works. But the developer went completely bankrupt right in the middle of Phase 2. When I bought my house, I got it for a fraction of what it should have cost. It was a foreclosure situation, a fully finished 4-bedroom house sitting on a paved street. The catch was the neighborhood itself. Out of the 300 planned lots, maybe 40 had houses on them. Out of those 40, only about 12 were actually finished. And out of those 12, I was one of only 3 people living there. It was a very strange place to reside. You don't really understand how much background noise a normal neighborhood has until you live somewhere that has absolutely none. There were no dogs barking, no kids playing in the street, no lawnmowers running on Saturday mornings. Just wide, freshly paved asphalt streets winding through hundreds of empty dirt lots and half-built, skeletal wooden frames wrapped in weatherproofing plastic. My house was at the end of a cul-de-sac on the far west side of the development. My nearest neighbor was an older guy named Greg, who lived about 4 blocks away. I think I saw him exactly twice the entire time I lived there. For all intents and purposes, I was completely isolated out there. At the time, I was working remotely as a software QA tester. My hours were totally inverted. I'd usually wake up around 2 in the afternoon, work until midnight, and then stay up until 5 or 6 in the morning. Because I was staring at a screen all night, I developed a habit of taking long walks to clear my head before I went to bed. Usually, I'd head out around 2 or 3 in the morning. I know it sounds weird to wander around an empty, half-built neighborhood in the middle of the night, but honestly, it was peaceful. The streetlights were all fully functional, so the streets were bathed in this harsh, bright orange light. It felt perfectly safe. Occasionally, I'd notice small things out of place. A crushed water bottle near my driveway, a cigarette butt on the edge of my lawn. But I always just assumed the wind blew trash down from the active construction sites a few miles away. That routine lasted for about 4 months. Then, the 3rd week of February, things started getting strange. It started on a Tuesday night. The weather had been unseasonably warm, so I decided to take a longer route than usual. I cut down a street called Oak Hollow Way. This was one of the streets where the construction had stopped abruptly. Half the houses on this block were just poured concrete foundations. A few were framed out with 2x4s, and a couple had roofs, but no windows or doors. I was walking down the center of the road, listening to a podcast with one earbud in. It was incredibly quiet. The only sound was my own sneakers hitting the asphalt. As I passed a house that was about 70% finished, it had siding and a roof, but the front door was just a sheet of plywood nailed over the frame. I stopped. I took my earbud out. I thought I had heard something coming from inside the structure. I stood there in the middle of the street, holding my breath and listening. For a long time, there was nothing. Just the low hum of the street lights. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a stray cat sniffing around the debris. But as I started to walk away, I heard it again. It wasn't an animal. It was a heavy, scraping sound, like someone dragging a wooden pallet across a concrete floor. It lasted for maybe 3 seconds, and then it stopped. I stood frozen. My first thought was that it was a squatter. The neighborhood was remote, but it wasn't impossible for someone homeless to wander out this far looking for a place to sleep. If it was a squatter, I didn't want any trouble. I wasn't a cop, and I didn't care if someone was crashing in a house owned by a dead bank. I backed up a few steps, keeping my eyes on the dark, empty squares where the windows were supposed to be. Nothing moved. There was no light inside. I turned around and walked briskly back the way I came, constantly checking over my shoulder until I was back on the main road. I locked my doors that night and checked the security cameras I had installed over the driveway, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. By the time I woke up the next afternoon, I had convinced myself I was overreacting. I didn't walk down Oak Hollow Way for the next few nights. I stuck to the finished streets closer to the entrance. But on Friday night, the weirdness followed me. It had rained heavily all day Thursday, turning the dirt lots into a thick, soupy mess of red Texas clay. I went out for my walk around 2:30 a.m. I was about 2 blocks from my house, walking along the sidewalk, when I noticed the tracks. They were tire tracks, deeply rutted in the mud that had washed out over the curb. They led straight up into the driveway of an empty lot right next to me. The rain had stopped hours ago, but these tracks hadn't washed out at all. The mud was pushed up in sharp ridges. Someone had driven up onto this empty lot very recently. I followed the tracks with my eyes. They went up the driveway, cut across the poured concrete pad, and went all the way to the back edge of the property where it met a line of dense, unmanaged scrub brush. As I was looking at the tracks, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. About 4 blocks down the street, at the main intersection, a vehicle was slowly pulling around the corner. I stepped back into the shadow of a large electrical box on the corner. It was a white, windowless cargo van, standard issue, but it was driving with its headlights completely off. The only illumination came from the amber street lights reflecting off its dirty paint. It was moving at a crawl, creeping along the curb. I watched, my heart starting to thump against my ribs, as the van rolled silently down the street. The engine was incredibly quiet, almost like it was coasting in neutral. The van stopped in front of a house 3 lots down from where I was hiding. This was one of the houses that was mostly finished but abandoned. The engine cut out completely. I held my breath, waiting to see who would get out. Neither the front doors nor the side panel doors opened. Instead, after about 30 seconds of complete silence, the back doors of the van swung open. There was no dome light inside. It was just a pitch-black rectangle. A person stepped out of the back. They were dressed in dark clothing, wearing a hooded sweatshirt pulled up. They didn't look around. They didn't hesitate. They just walked with a brisk, purposeful stride straight across the wet lawn and disappeared around the side of the dark house. The back doors of the van remained open. I stayed pinned behind the electrical box, afraid to even shift my weight. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. The street was dead silent. The person never came back out.
Got it.
Eventually, I couldn't take the waiting anymore. I slowly backed away, keeping the electrical box between me and the van until I reached the next street over. Then I practically sprinted back to my house. I locked the deadbolt, armed the alarm system, and sat in my living room with all the lights off, watching my exterior cameras. The van never drove past my house. The next day, I drove my car over to that street in broad daylight. The van was gone. I parked in front of the house where the person had disappeared and got out. I walked up the driveway. There were no tire tracks on the concrete, but in the mud on the side of the house, I saw footprints. Lots of them, They were deeply indented, overlapping, heading toward the backyard. I followed them. In the back of the house, there was a sliding glass door meant to lead out to a patio that had never been built.
Everything all right? No.
The glass was shattered. Shards were scattered across the dirty linoleum floor inside. I peered through the broken door. The inside of the house smelled like mold and stale cigarette smoke. In the center of the living room floor, there was a pile of trash. Fast food wrappers, crushed water bottles, and cigarette butts. But what really made my stomach drop was what was sitting in the corner of the room. It was a brand new, heavy-duty sleeping bag, rolled out flat. Next to it was a large black plastic storage bin. I went back to my car, locked the doors, and immediately called the non-emergency police line. I explained the situation, told them about the squatter's setup. The dispatcher sounded bored. She took down the address and said they'd send a cruiser out to check it when one was available. A cruiser did drive through the neighborhood about 4 hours later. I watched them roll past my house on the camera. They drove down the street where the van had been, slowed down for maybe 10 seconds in front of the house, and then kept going. They never got out of the car. That night, I decided not to walk. I stayed inside, drank too much coffee, and kept checking my cameras. Around 3 a.m., I saw it. On the camera facing my street, a figure walked past the end of my driveway. It was a person in a dark hoodie. They were walking slowly, right down the middle of the cul-de-sac. They didn't look toward my house, but they walked up to the end of the pavement, stood there for a few minutes, looking out into the empty dirt lots beyond, and then turned around and walked back out of frame. I didn't sleep at all that night. By Tuesday of the following week, the paranoia was eating me alive. I hadn't seen the van again, and the cameras hadn't picked up any more late-night pedestrians. I started telling myself I was getting worked up over nothing. I needed to get out of the house. The walls were closing in on me. Around 1:30 a.m., I laced up my shoes and stepped out the front door. I intended to just do a quick loop around my immediate block. Stay in the light, stay close to home. The air was completely still. I walked briskly, my hands jammed in my jacket pockets. I hit the corner of my street and turned left, walking down the sidewalk of a street lined with identical, empty two-story houses. I was about halfway down the block when I got that feeling. The heavy, crawling sensation on the back of your neck that tells you someone is looking directly at you. I stopped walking. I looked around. The street was empty. The streetlights buzzed their low, monotonous hum. I slowly turned my head, scanning the dark houses on my right. There was a house about 50 feet ahead of me. It was fully framed, roofed, and had windows installed, but no siding. Just yellow insulation foam board wrapping the entire exterior. In the second-story window, perfectly centered in the glass, someone was standing. It was too dark to make out any features. It was just a black silhouette against the slightly lighter darkness of the room behind them. But they were standing completely still, facing the street, facing me. My chest tightened so hard, I couldn't pull in a full breath. I stood paralyzed on the sidewalk, staring up at the window. The figure didn't step back. They didn't retreat. I took a slow step backward. My heels scraped the concrete. The moment I made that sound, the silhouette didn't flinch.
Zip ties
Instead,
and duct tape.
it slowly leaned
That's
forward.
what we found at the unfinished
I
houses.
watched, my throat tight, as the dark shape pressed right up against the glass. I couldn't see a face, just the outline of a head and hands resting flat on the window pane. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity. Then, smoothly and silently, the figure simply slid sideways, melting into the pitch black of the unfinished room. It wasn't a startled retreat. It was deliberate. As I reached the corner of my street, I heard a sound that made my blood turn to ice water. From inside the house with the yellow foam board, down on the ground floor, came the loud, distinct sound of a wooden door being wrenched open. I didn't look back. I broke into a full sprint. I tore down the street, my sneakers slapping loudly on the asphalt. I could hear something behind me. It wasn't the heavy, clumsy footsteps of someone running in boots. It was a fast, rhythmic, soft, slapping sound, like someone running in socks or bare feet on the pavement. And it was getting closer. I reached my driveway and fumbled frantically for my keys. I had them in my hand, but my fingers were shaking so badly, I dropped them onto the concrete. The metal jingled loudly in the quiet night. I dropped to my knees, snatching the keys up, and glanced back down the street. About 100 feet away, just coming under the pool of light from the street lamp, was a man. He was wearing dark jeans and a gray t-shirt. He was completely barefoot. He wasn't running anymore. He was walking toward me, taking long, deliberate strides. He held something in his right hand, a heavy, dark object that hung down by his leg. It looked like a piece of rebar or a crowbar. I jammed the key into the deadbolt, twisted it, and threw my weight against the door. I practically fell inside, slamming the heavy wooden door shut behind me and throwing the deadbolt home. I engaged the chain lock and backed away into the dark hallway, panting hysterically. I crept into the living room and pulled up the camera feed on my tablet. I clicked on the front door camera. The feed buffered for a second, then cleared. The man was standing on my porch. He was standing right in front of the camera, looking directly into the lens. His face was entirely unremarkable. Average age, average build, short, dark hair. He looked like a guy who might change your oil or bag your groceries. But his expression was completely blank, dead. He stood there for 2 full minutes, just staring into the camera. He never raised the metal bar in his hand. He never tried the door. Then, very calmly, he turned around, walked down the steps, and disappeared into the darkness down the street. I called the police. They sent 3 cars within 10 minutes. They searched the neighborhood. They went to the house with the yellow foam board. They found the front door wide open. Inside, they found a mattress on the floor, but the man was gone. When the officer came back to take my statement, he looked deeply uncomfortable. He kept glancing over his shoulder toward the dark street. "Did you catch the guy?" I asked, my voice shaking. "No, sir," the officer said, adjusting his radio. "Place is a maze out there in the dark." He paused, looking down at my front door lock. "We did find that setup in the house down the street, though. The one with the broken glass." Another officer walked up the driveway, holding a clear plastic evidence bag. He didn't say anything, just showed it to the cop taking my statement. Inside the bag, illuminated by the porch light, I could clearly see several heavy-duty zip ties and 2 rolls of silver duct tape. The first officer cleared his throat, avoiding my eyes. "We're going to have a car sit at the entrance of the neighborhood for the rest of the night. If I were you, sir, I wouldn't wait until morning to pack a bag." I didn't stay at a hotel. I broke my lease on the mortgage terms and moved out 3 days later. I packed whatever I could fit into my car and hired movers to get the rest a week later while a private security guard stood in the driveway. I never found out who that guy was or who the person in the van was.
Zip ties.
The
and
police
duct
never
tape.
caught them.
That's what we found at the
But the thing
unfinished
that bothers
houses.
me the most, the thing that still keeps me awake at night, wasn't the chase or the evidence bag full of zip ties. When the movers were packing up my house, one of them asked me why I was throwing away perfectly good outdoor furniture. I told him I didn't own any outdoor furniture. He looked confused and pointed out the window to my backyard. Sitting on the small concrete patio behind my house, facing the back door, was a cheap, white plastic lawn chair. I had never seen it before in my life. Someone had brought it there. Given the mud caked on the bottom of the legs, and the small pile of crushed cigarette butts on the concrete beside it, they hadn't just sat there once. It completely reframed everything that happened. The man wasn't just a random squatter I had startled on my walk. He had been sitting right outside my bedroom window, in the dark, night after night. He knew my work hours. He knew my routine. He knew exactly when I left the house to go for my walks. When I was running for my life down that empty street, fumbling with my keys in a blind panic, I wasn't escaping a stranger. I was locking myself inside a house with someone who had already made himself right at home in my backyard, waiting for the perfect time to let himself in.